Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome back to the Big Things from the Big Story podcast. We have accomplished yet another week of reading the Bible together, and this week I've got with me one of the original, in fact, the first special guest of the Big Things podcast. Welcome back, Josh. Welcome to the studio. I mean,
it's nice in here.
Yeah,
you've really upgraded quite a bit.
when Josh recorded, he was on the second episode ever, and when we recorded back in the day, back in January, it was just a webcam, just a foot in front of your face, just sitting there. And now look, you brought your own foot mug with us.
That's right, still in the face.
Just kind of a throwback. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for tagging along with us for yet another episode of the podcast. Today is Monday, May 4th, and this week we read some interesting and great stories in the Word. This week we read April 27th through May 3rd in the One Year Bible. If you're not following along, we encourage you to do so. You can find it on the Bible app and just keep up with the story. Just pick up right where we're at. No need to go all the way back to the beginning of the year. You got it.
The audio portion helps out a lot.
It helps a lot. Especially, there was a point this week, like in the middle of the week, we got behind. Yeah. And so I knew that we had to catch up. And so last night I was like, we got to listen to like three of the days, right? And I was pleasantly surprised we were only one behind. So we just listened to two and then went to bed, and it was perfect. Like, it was no big deal. But yeah, the audio Bible part, it helps a lot. It helps a lot. So we did read in the book of Judges this week, Judges chapter 7, all the way through chapter 18, verse 31. Talk about that here in just a minute. And we finished out the book of Luke, starting in Luke chapter 23, and we read all the way through John chapter 3, verse 21. So we entered into a new gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and now John, as we entered in the first three chapters this week. So it was some fun stuff. I was just kind of telling Josh about some of the things I noticed, and I'm excited to hear some of the things you noticed too as well. Well, I don't think I was doing icebreakers yet when you were here. I just kind of was, we were doing a 15-minute show at that point, and it quickly turned into 30, 40 minutes pretty quickly.
Yes, it did.
So now we're just sitting in that, and we're like, 35 minutes is perfect. But I wanted to ask you, kind of as our icebreaker question is, everybody kind of knows you, especially around Blue Starr. They kind of know some of your background. They know Gene's your father-in-law, and he's one of the elders here. They know you're a therapist. And, of course, I think probably the coolest thing you do around here at Blue Starr is CR.
That's right.
These are all really big factors of you. But I was thinking, I was like, man, what about just the fun personality of Josh? So what are some of your hobbies? What are some of the fun things you like to do? I know I've had some interesting conversations about the things you're into as a kid, and I'm just curious. So,
some of my hobbies, for example, is angering my kids.
Judson, are you watching?
That's right, son. Welcome home. I pick on my boys. Judson being, especially for those of you remember him, he's like 6'5", 6'6", I think it is. And he doesn't have he's the oldest cousin, doesn't have a bigger brother.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Yeah.
And kidding aside, though, it's like hobbies. I write. I do some writing. I am writing a book now for therapy.
Okay, yeah.
So as you had said earlier, I'm a marriage and family therapist.
Yep.
I'm licensed here in the state of Oklahoma. I've been writing a book on parenting, like foster care kids or kids from hard places.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's a lot of it, all of it is based on the experience that I've had using a little more eclectic style.
Sure.
But also, it comes from 3 to 4 years of experience with a single family.
Yeah.
And I'm working on finding a publisher right now.
Okay.
Or self-publishing. I don't know what that means yet. So
yeah, you're like, I'm exploring what this all means. He's like, you've got the book pretty much written, right?
Yeah, the book is written. I've got a few feelers out there with some friends that are looking over it as editing purposes, and but it's a hybrid. That's what I love about it. I love about myself. It's a hybrid. Yeah. It can be a manual for a therapist to use, or for yourself. Yeah. In family counseling, it can be a narrated a guide for parents, like some of our foster care parents, for example, that are struggling out at the home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or it could also be for people wanting to get into not just foster care, but they have traumatized kids.
Yeah.
And it's a unique blend of stuff, and I've seen a lot of success with it with other families as well over the past year.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's really
the
awesome.
other is kind of a manual for men.
Okay, awesome.
A few years ago, I did a very extensive 2-quarter class on being God's man and what that meant.
Yeah,
and that's kind of my next project right now.
Okay,
that's awesome. I'm putting that together as a it's a manual, I guess you could say.
Sure. Yeah.
Of what it means to be God's man in so many different facets and details.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm not trying to give away, but some of the things I've just really been thinking of that I think would be fantastic classes just to do. If you're here at Blue Starr, you know what I'm talking about, like some of our multiple Sunday morning classes or something like that. But I just think parenting, which really leans into the whole, being a man thing, and marriage also leans into. There's just a lot of these like family life type things that I think would be really good to do some specific classes for in the future. And so that's been on my radar. So don't be surprised if I tap your shoulder at some point. I know we've already got. It seems like every time I think of a class, we've already got another one rolling. But it's someday I will pop one in there and we will do something else. So. What else other than writing? Is you're like all I do is write? So.
No, I think about that. When the opportunity arises, I love to cook. I barbecue a lot.
Okay.
Some. I cook a lot at home. I game with my son every night with Jace.
Yeah,
I game with him every now and again as kind of almost a silent way of spending time with your kids.
Sure.
in a way that I'm present with him in a thing that he likes to do.
It's a bonding moment for him, right? And you're trying your best at least with that.
And to my family's chagrin, I people. That's a hobby.
Yeah, you're definitely a people person, which I appreciate that because I like to connect with people, but I can only do it for so long, and I just need to recharge, and that's been coming out of the podcast a lot lately for some reason. So, well, cool. Well, thank you for coming back to the podcast. Thanks for sharing a little bit of your life, and it's just really cool to kind of come full circle. We're not halfway through the year quite yet, but as we near summertime, Josh is back, and Yay. He was the first guest, so I think that's really, really cool. Well, I kind of want to give the recap of what we read in the Old Testament this week, and then we can talk about it some, and I'd love to hear some of the things that maybe you're thinking about that you're pulling out of it. But this week in the Old Testament, we continued on in the book of Judges, and we hung out in Judges for the whole story this week in the Old Testament. So we stopped kind of in the middle of the story of Gideon last week in chapter 6. And so as we move into chapter 7, we look at Gideon's victory and his decline. We see the story of the 300 men that God whittles down, the army, just, I think, to show his might and his power instead of human power. Even the way that the Midianites are defeated is also kind of a powerful example of God's power, because it wasn't out of the mightiness of the army, it was out of their own fear, right? And so we see Gideon not only defeat the Midianites, then he goes on to defeat all the Midianite kings, and he later brings, peace to Israel for a time. Later in his life, though, unfortunately, Gideon makes an ephod and it becomes an idol to Israel. And it starts taking them back down this path of unfaithfulness. And so after Gideon's death especially, they fall deep into unrighteousness. It's Judges chapter 9 where we see Abimelech, which is Gideon's son, and he leads the people even further into the unrighteous way. He leads with violence and treachery, like that's his whole MO. And so God brings judgment through all this conflict that's within the nation of Israel. At the end of chapter 9, Abimelech's pretty short. He doesn't have a long run, but we see the death of him. He actually requests that one of his armor bearers stab him because he had just been hit in the head with a rock by a girl.
Yep.
And that's not how you're going to go out if you're King Abimelech. So I think that story is kind of humorous too. As we enter into chapter 10 all the way through chapter 12, we kind of quickly go through the other judges, including some of the minor judges like Tola and Jer, who bring temporary stability, to the nation of Israel, but then we see the cycle continuing. Unrighteous unrighteous again. And they go back to worshiping idols, back into oppression by people like the Amorites. We see the brief story of Jephthah, who does return the people to righteousness for just a moment, but then the story continues on and they go back into the cycle. We slow down when we get to chapter 13 of Judges. For just a moment, we talk about a man named Samson. Samson enters the story when Israel is under Philistine oppression, but he himself is born a Nazirite who's taken the vow to set himself apart, as a deliverer of the people of Israel. And so we see this description of a man, and obviously he's big and he's strong and he's mighty. That's who Samson is. That's his whole picture. But he lives impulsively, and he's often disobedient towards not only his vow before God, but to God's instructions, to all of it. And so Samson's relationship with a Philistine woman leads to repeated conflict and a whole bunch of family drama, if you want to call it that. And then eventually Delilah ultimately betrays him, and it leads to his capture.
Jerk.
And they gouge out his eyes. I don't think we talk about that, but his eyes got gouged out. Chapter 16.
We usually talk about the G-rated version.
Yeah, that's true. I was telling Courtney that. I was like, I don't think many of the pictures really focus on the gouged out eyes quite, because in chapter 16 we see his final act, and this is usually what the picture's of, where he destroys the Philistine temple by killing a whole bunch of Philistines by pushing down the pillars, pulling down the pillars, and collapsing the building on himself and all of them. And that's kind of where we end the story of Samson, obviously. That makes sense, right? And that's usually the artist's depiction that we get, is that final story of Samson. All right, in the last two chapters that we read this week in the Old Testament, Judges chapter 17 and 18, we see the story kind of shift from the details of each judge and how their rule was, and Samson and all of that, and we kind of go in and look at the spiritual condition of Israel. We see a man named Micah who creates idols, and he sets up his own priest, which again shows the religious corruption, falling away from God. And then we see the tribe of Dan steal Micah's idols and his priests, and they establish their own idolatry in a new spot, and just all sorts of, unrighteous behavior. And it's kind of a bleak place to end as we end out in Judges this week, because we just see God's people. Remember, the nation of Israel is God's people continuing to return to false gods. And it's hard to even hear that, because they've had this promise for generations upon generations now of being God's people, and yet in Judges chapter 18, we have kind of this final phrase that says, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And every time we see that in Scripture, it's not a positive thing. It's they're living unrighteously. So it's just kind of a sad spiritual state as we end up here in Judges chapter 18 this week. There's a lot. There's a lot in Judges. And I think the most fun stuff in Judges was kind of last week. But then there was Samson. So there's just a lot in there.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know. What are some things that you kind of noticed in the Old Testament this week?
Well, I know this idea doesn't start with Gideon. But I think Gideon really shows us the most shining example of still having victory, but not letting God change you.
Yeah.
And it's funny that we unintentionally preempted that with the talk of being of God's man. Yeah. And that it was not intentional, but it was Gideon is there. He says all the right stuff. He says, and the Lord will watch over you. The Lord will lead you. I don't remember the exact quote now, but he gets that victory, but God's not changing anything. And that's a big part of parenting, is that generational fallout. And so Gideon really hits us with that. And he struggled at first, as thankfully we all do. Yeah. The greatest thing about Christianity is this isn't a place for perfection.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I get accepted too, so even better.
But you're right. The beginning of his story, he's full of doubt and unbelief and, lack of power. And it looks like he trusts God for a moment, because he does, but it doesn't, if you want to use the words, it doesn't stick, because he as time goes on, he falls back into, I don't know if it's fear or it's just, slipping into living life, but not serving God, if you will.
Yeah. And there are times that we will win. I guess you can call it winning in life, but not letting God change your heart. And the fallout can sometimes come a month later, or it came through like Abimelech, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Abimelech saw the perfect example for that is his dad, was a great leader at one point, but then like Elijah did, for example, as soon as he turns around, he builds that epoch. I don't know how to pronounce that word.
Yeah, that's good enough for me.
But he builds that, and that was definitely not what God wanted them to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And God, he did not allow God to change his heart.
Yeah.
And so Abimelech didn't even start with a changed heart.
No, he just started with a hard heart from the beginning. And this is off track, but that's what we do here. I can't remember who I was talking to the other day, but it's interesting because of the cycle that we see, unrighteous, righteous, back and forth. Somebody I was talking to the other day said it's probably because the grandson was watching the grandpa be righteous, and then dad was a complete mess, right? So that's where it goes back into that generational thing. But why does it have to be that way? Let's all be righteous. Let's be grandfather, father, son, all living for the Lord. Right?
I know. Let's live perfectly. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's be perfect. There you go. See you guys next week. So Gideon is kind of at the beginning of the stories, and not to jump us to the end of where we're at in Judges this week.
Yeah.
But not that the middle's not important. It's just not as interesting. But kind of the end of where we read this week. Samson is. It's such an interesting story. And if you were here last night at Blue Starr, our Glow group focused on Samson. Keith kind of led us through. He wanted to talk about, and we had a really good discussion about if God is just and how God uses people, because Samson's kind of like a weird story of someone who should be living for God and has the Nazirite vow and is born a Nazirite, but then is also like just completely off the rails at most of the story. You know what I mean? And in the end, I still think that God still uses him for his plan, because God's not bound by good and evil. He can use righteous and unrighteous both for his plan. And so I found the story of Samson kind of interesting too.
And all throughout the world history, God has done that.
Hey, absolutely.
Whether it's been Gideon or Samson, or even like, as you know, our country's celebrating 250 years.
Yeah.
And like even then, like Thomas Jefferson's a good example. He was a slave owner. He was definitely not moral.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, when he became president, he ended all of international slave trade, and told the country, "Hey, 20 years, we're going to be done with this."
Yeah.
And so God used these morally unrighteous people to do righteous things.
Yeah.
And which is exactly what Christianity is supposed to be about.
Yeah.
It's that redemption factor. I love that part. And with Samson always struck. I was about to name somebody, I won't. Always struck me as somebody that I know, and
I'm glad you didn't name. Could have been taken multiple ways.
But like everything comes out right for this person. Obviously, from my perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Everything comes out right. And, like, for example, Samson is exactly it. Born into the right people in Israel. Not just an Israelite, but the right people in Israel.
Nazirites,
was given what? Amazing, incredible, unbelievable strength. And all he had to do was follow God's commands.
Yeah.
All he had to do, right?
Script, man. Yep. But that was, and it's, what I think I like about Samson is because it's, even though we don't want to be like him in a lot of ways, it's so relatable to the little traps he falls into, right? Like he sees a girl, he falls in love. He's like, that's going to be my wife. And they're like, whoa. And that was even that was breaking his vow, right? Because she was a Philistine. And so that's breaking his Nazirite vow. Or even the fact, when he comes across the carcass and there's honey in the carcass, he shouldn't be touching a dead thing, but man, that honey looks good. I'm going to take some home, give it to my family, and make a riddle out of it. They're breaking their own law, and they don't even know it, right? And so just to me, some of his pitfalls are relatable. Maybe more for men than anybody else, right? Because the woman got him multiple times. But, yeah, it's just God can still use imperfect people for his glory. And I think at the very end of Samson's story, that was the one thing I really wanted to point out was God's will was still done. His, obviously that's not the glorious end that I think Samson ever imagined for his life, but God used him to defeat some of the Philistines, even though it had been a whole mess of a road getting there. Yeah.
But he wouldn't have had any of that strength without God's grace and forgiveness on top of all that.
And that was the really interesting thing.
And so it's like part of our life, even as, we cycle through all this, just like Israel, and that we gain strength when we fall back to God.
Yeah. And I found that really interesting too. And I don't know if I just hadn't noticed it in previous readings, but, his strength is all gone. His hair has been cut. Delilah's completely ruined his life from his perspective, right? And it's in that moment when he talks to God again to receive the last blow of strength, if you will. And I don't know if you want to call that a surrender or just...
I would.
Yeah.
I would call that a surrender and a redemption at the same time.
Redemption's a good word, too.
Which is the best thing about that word. And I love teaching this with families, and especially with parents or couples in couples therapy. Redemption is a big word for me. I have it I have a card, 5x7.
Yeah.
It's just the word.
Yeah.
And on the backside, it's laminated. So on the backside, I have them write out what that means.
Oh, yeah.
And discuss it. And the coolest thing about that is I'll do the same thing at the end, and I'll write on the back of it. But I won't show them. I won't show them right away. And what it always comes down to, redemption is, proving that I'm sorry, or this long road of, I can prove to you I deserve your love, or I can prove to you I deserve to come back. But redemption isn't about that at all. Redemption is about how our last chapter, and this is what I write down on the card, is our last chapter is not the end of our story.
Yeah.
Our worst chapter is not the end. Our worst chapter is not the end of our story.
Yeah, I like that. I like clinging on to words. Sometimes another good one that Courtney and I really hung on to for a couple years really was the term surrender, right? Because God, through His redemption, asks us to surrender our control, right, and our desires and things like that. So. Anyway, that's a completely off track. Well, was there anything else in the Old Testament as we're cruising through this week that you thought was kind of interesting or that you wanted to mention?
I think we kind of hit on it.
Okay. Yeah, there's some really interesting stories in Judges. That's why I like Judges. If you kind of got bored through Numbers and such like that, Judges kind of brings it back. It's like, whoa, this is in the Bible. There would be some... PG-13 R-rated movies that come out of the book of Judges if you were to shoot some of those. All right, well, moving into the New Testament, man, we ended at a tough spot last week in the book of Luke because we're right here at the very end, starting in Luke chapter 23, and we start at the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. Pontius Pilate declares that Jesus Christ is innocent, but the crowd demands, crucify him. Crucify him. And so Jesus is beaten, he's mocked, he's led to the cross, but on the cross he shows mercy. He says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And he promises, to the repentant criminal right next to him that I will see you in paradise. And just so many beautiful things. And then darkness covers the land. And Jesus breathes his last breath, and the Son of God has been murdered on a tree. Mm-hmm. He's then buried and put in a tomb that was provided by Joseph of Arimathea, and it seems like the story is over. But I like in Luke, the story's not over for very long, right? That's chapter 23. But chapter 24, we see the women who go to an empty tomb. Mm-hmm. And the angels announce that Jesus has risen in chapter 24. And then he appears to the two disciples on the road, and even though they never realized it was him until I think this is so beautiful as well until they're breaking bread with him, right? And I think that's so interesting. And then he appears to the apostles and to the disciples and proving that he is alive, and he opens their minds to the truth and the mystery of the gospel because he's right in front of them. And at the very end of Luke, we have what we would call the Great Commission, right? Where he tells them to preach to all nations. And then he ascends into heaven. And that's the end of Luke's gospel. And we can take a complete stark shift because we go right back to the beginning again in the book of John. So it's kind of a strange week. But, as we enter the beginning with John, John's like, the birth of Jesus? No. Before that. We got to start all the way back at the beginning of all creation. So John says that the Word became flesh in the beginning. In in the beginning was the Word, and then the Word became flesh. Let's get those in the right order, which reveals like this incredible power about how Jesus was there from the beginning of all time. Then we enter into the story of Jesus on earth. We start with John the Baptist preparing the way for Christ to come. John himself identifies him as the Lamb of God. It's interesting to me that in John's gospel, we don't really see the baptism of Jesus in all of its detail like we do other places. But obviously it happened because John refers to it. He says the Holy Spirit came down and is still with him. It came down in the form of a dove. And it's like, oh, yeah, that was his baptism story. So John's just hitting a little different side of it. This is kind of the starting point of, Jesus' ministry right here at the beginning of John, in John chapter 1. And so then we see him start calling people to follow him. We see him calling Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathanael. And as we enter into chapter 2 from chapter 1, we see the first miracle of Jesus, which is where Jesus turned water into a wine at the wedding at Cana. We see Jesus cleansing the temple of the corrupt merchants, which really shows his zeal for the Lord and his house. And of course, teaching about how the temple will be destroyed and then rebuilt in 3 days. But he's not talking about the physical temple at all. John points it out really plainly. He says he's talking about his body himself, which plays right into where we just heard that happening in Luke, which is really awesome. In John chapter 3, we see the story of Jesus and Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus seeking understanding, and Jesus teaches him about being born again, which is this crazy thing that Nicodemus is trying to understand. What in the world are you talking about? What does that answer mean? But Jesus says you must be born of water and spirit to enter the kingdom of God. And so Jesus explains that his mission is not about this earth. It's not about condemnation, but rather it's about salvation to all people. And we get one of the most famous verses of all time. It's here, John 3:16, which explains how God so loved the world that he gave salvation to all. And so the challenge of Jesus, as we're kind of wrapping up here in chapter 3 this week, in the middle of chapter 3, is that light has come into the world and people must choose to live in the light or to remain in the darkness. And so that's where we ended up in John chapter 3 today. So, man, I said that I love Luke, because I do. I love all the detail in Luke, but I like how John is so much different than the book of Luke. And even, some of the stories, some of his perspective, all of that is just really unique. So I think that's awesome.
I greatly enjoyed John as well. It's probably maybe a little more so. I like he's a little more matter of fact.
Yeah.
And
it is. Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot of what's the right word for it? Not a whole lot of like poetry, for example.
Yeah.
There's not anything hidden. You don't have to try and figure it out.
No filler words in there. Yeah. He's not trying to catch a word count. Yeah, absolutely. And then I just love the perspective, and I don't know if you guys have ever watched The Chosen. We're like multiple seasons behind. We need to catch up. But I just love and this is all ad-lib for TV, right? But John's sitting there like, where do I start? Where do I start with my recounting of the story of Christ? And it's like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And it's like, that's so unique that John goes, he recognizes the creator and the creation and the lordship of all of that just by going back to the beginning and looking at the Word, Logos, who becomes flesh. And I just think that's super cool. So I love that in the beginning start of John. It wasn't like, Luke, there's a baby born. No, it's in the beginning was the Word. Yeah.
And that's one of John's biggest accolades is he didn't just see Jesus' miracles. He didn't just see the story and listen to the story. Because, these guys wouldn't have known any of this stuff to write down if Jesus had not told these stories.
Right.
Or that Mary, his mother, was with them for a time and was telling some of these stories.
Right. And
John saw more of the bigger picture than everyone else.
That's how I feel about it, at least, right? Like, it's, he's more understanding, not that any of the other Gospels are bad, because they tell the whole story, and John doesn't get all the details. He's like, but It's just his perspective on it all is so much different. And I think that's super, super cool. I also like, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I really love the first miracle of Jesus that is recorded in John is him turning water into wine. It's not recorded anywhere else. Maybe it was just too awkward for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That,
I don't know. They were there. So.
Yeah, you would think this would have been a big story. But I love this story, and I haven't tried to shock Blue Starr yet, but I really love to walk up on a Sunday morning with a couple bottles of wine.
Yes,
and that might get you fired, but because this story I think is a little awkward for us. Yeah, you just got to keep them. I'll return them when we're all done.
They're in a closed container.
But something we don't realize is, his mother comes up to him and is the one that says, "Hey, you need to do this for this wedding." And what we don't realize is the cultural aspect of this.
Yeah.
That for them, wine was joy. Wine was the celebration. And so if you're at a wedding and the wine is gone, the celebration and the joy is gone. And so really Jesus did do a miracle. He didn't just get them something to drink. He did something culturally huge for them.
Yeah, it was more than mama just needed to drink.
Yeah, it was. And I think sometimes we get a little stuck there like, oh, it's just wine.
And this is a really wonderful example for moms.
Yeah.
I love this part, this story. It's a short story. It's a short miracle. And we glaze over it pretty easily.
I know, yeah.
But it's a wonderful story for moms because this is exactly what moms do for us, especially for boys. They ground us.
Yeah. And
this is what Mary was doing right then and there. She wasn't just, hey, I want some more of the good stuff. Yeah. This was her. She knew where Jesus was at mentally. She knew where he was at emotionally. Because his whole life.
Mom.
She knew who he was his whole life. And she knew how great and awesome this guy was going to be.
Yeah.
And she could read, nobody else could. She could read the turmoil in his face. Yeah. He was about to get started on this literally world-changing ministry.
Yes, sir.
And she didn't know how it was going to end. But it wasn't about the end. It was about the here and the now. And she knew that he needed to be present. Because exactly what you had said, the wine is the joy of the party.
It is.
It wasn't just... I know contextually, it was the best wine was always served first.
Yes,
and then the watered down version was served last because everyone had enough to drink.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But for Jesus to have not only have done this, but it got him out of his own head.
Yeah,
it grounded him where he needed to be, and he even says, "It's not my time yet," and
she's like, come on, boy, let's go. And it's great too, the fact that it's the good wine and it's recognized, right, that it's the good wine. It just adds more power to the fact of the miraculous work, right?
Oh yeah.
And I mean, you really couldn't argue the fact that pitchers, big jugs of water being turned into wine was not, that doesn't happen on a regular basis. But the fact that God not only returns with joy, the Son of God brings back joy, but he brings the best for last, which is kind of like what he does for us as Christians, right? He brings joy back into our lives, and then he brings the best for last. Mm-hmm. So there you go. There's my sermon notes of the day.
So do you ever think that later parties where Jesus wasn't there, but James was there, and like people were running out of wine, and they looked at James.
Hey, your brother, you got any of that, same stuff your brother could do? I don't know. I hope that there was less running out of wine because that's a big deal for him. So hopefully he didn't have to run into that situation. Well, was there anything else you saw in the New Testament this week? Again, it was kind of weird seeing the end of the story and the way beginning from John's perspective. And then, of course, the first miracle of Jesus this week. Just kind of cool seeing those parallels too, I guess you could say.
I like the addition of John the Baptist in this part. I know it's not as big as some of the other Gospels, but still having that consistent in there. Yeah, because he was preaching Jesus before it was cool.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, he was out there saying all the right stuff and proclaiming that Jesus was coming long before that, and that really stood out to me. I can't tell you. I can tell you, I've only read the Bible maybe 5 times all the way through. This is my 6th time.
Yeah, that's a big job. So good.
And I've read other books multiple times, way more than that. But it's like, it's awesome how the Spirit is in you and it helps you notice something different each time.
Oh yeah,
and that's what really stood out to me this time in the beginning oration there of John was John the Baptist, and he stood out, and it led to
Yep.
But he was doing it before it was cool, and then he kept going.
Yeah, I don't think we've covered that. John's got a pretty graphic description of John the Baptist's demise too, which we will be probably reading it today, actually. So, sorry about that. Hopefully,
spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. As we enter this new week, so it's a rough beginning, but yeah, absolutely, and that's why I love the description of the word is living and active and sharper than a double-edged sword. We see new things all the time because it's a living word and it's actively working in our lives. And so, of course, the words might be the exact same that you've read before, but God's using them to hit your spirit and to show his Holy Spirit in your life in a new way. And that's so cool to me.
And that's Jesus does that there at the end of Luke, is that great example for us to follow. And that they're on Emmaus, the road to Emmaus?
Yeah, road to Emmaus, yeah.
And they don't know who he is.
Yeah,
but what is he doing? He's listening, he's discussing, and he even helps him reframe it.
Yeah,
for me, that's a very familiar,
you're like,
very familiar action.
That, yeah, but
that's exactly where, and I point parents to that too.
Yeah, and we didn't even talk about that this week, but can you imagine the mind-blowingness when you've been walking with this guy for this whole journey and you're talking about Jesus and this whole story, because basically they pick up the story like, whoa, you haven't heard about what happened to Jesus, and he kind of corrects them and reframes us all, and they sit down to have dinner, and then their eyes are open to the fact that he is Christ, and then he's gone.
Well, then from a human standpoint, you're a father, but you're also a man, and you're a preacher and a husband, and to have to be walking along, running across these people. Yeah, I mean, you knew, but the level of it's bigger than the word affirmation.
Sure,
but it's big. It's much bigger than that. To have that come back to you, like, hey, what? I went through all of this. I didn't want to, but I submitted to it, and I went through all of it anyway. Now that I'm back, they're doing it.
Yeah.
That would have been awesome. It's like when my son told me, "Dad, I think you were right about something." Judson, it's on recording now.
Yeah, it's like, oh, God the Father, this was a good plan. That we made at the beginning of time. Yeah, that is kind of an interesting thought. Well, yeah, there's some really good stuff both in the Old Testament and New Testament this week. So if you guys have been reading along, or maybe you haven't yet, I invite you to join us. Follow along in the 1 Year Bible. It's on the Bible app. We'd love to hear from you. We've got a Facebook group where, it's been a little quiet lately. I know we're getting the middle of the year, but go post something there. Tell us what you've been thinking about, maybe some of the Psalms that we don't get enough time to talk about on the podcast, some of those, what David writes, and just share some things from that, share some things from Proverbs. Just let us know what you're thinking, or leave a comment down below. We just love to hear from you. Speaking of Proverbs, I picked a little nugget of wisdom of the week here out of Proverbs chapter 14. It's verses 15 and 16, and we actually read this on May 1st this past week. But it says, "The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. One who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless." And I just thought that was a good piece of wisdom for our week.
You were there on Sunday morning Bible class, right?
Yeah, I came in a little bit late.
I don't remember scanning the rooms.
yeah, I was there. I was in the main Bible class, and then I came into the last one, or into
right at the end of chapter 3. Paul hits on this right in the middle of chapter 3, and at the end, Paul hits on this almost not perfectly, but he lands right on it.
Yeah, Second Thessalonians. Wow, chapter 3 is where we're at, right at the end of it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Josh, it's been a good week. Thank you for being here, man. I appreciate you coming back. It's been really, really cool. So
it's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. We would love to have you back. Maybe, we'll space you out, put you at the end of the year.
There you go.
I've got grand plans, but I don't want to reveal it yet. I'd love to do something as like the year-end season finale, but I don't know exactly what it would be yet. So we'll definitely try and get you back at that point.
I'll always be of help if you need me to be.
Okay. All right. Well, and also praying for you in your new venture and, life changes and new job and all of that. And I'm excited for you, but I'm also grateful that you had this opportunity to come on the show this week.
Thank you very much. And I can't go throughout can't end a podcast without saying, well, May the 4th be with you.
Oh, it is May the 4th. Wow. I didn't even realize that. Well, on that note, we will see you guys next week right here on the Big Things from the Big Story Podcast.